Hello, and I hope this message finds you well. Um, I felt called to make a little presentation today on a concept that is very important to me, and I hope it will be interesting to you too, especially if you're a teacher. And that is ungrading, also known as not grading, meaning how do I avoid using grades in my classroom practice? And why is that important? Why is that healthier, more productive for teachers and students? So I want to talk a little bit about what this concept is, as well as how I learned about it, how it was introduced to me, some potential applications, and sort of roadblocks you may encounter if you try this yourself. Um, yeah, so we'll go through this presentation together. So first, how did I encounter ungrading? I went to Colorado College, pictured here, and my first exposure to teaching practice was through the school writing center. And the writing center director at CC was very into ungrading. His version of that was that the introductory course for the writing center was mandatory pass fail. So this meant that you couldn't work at the writing center because you couldn't complete the training. You couldn't work there unless you were willing to accept a pass fail grade on your transcript. And for many would be tutors, this was a no go. They would go up to him and they would be like, hey, I have straight A's in school, and seeing a P on my transcript is going to ruin that aesthetic for me. And he would say, too bad. Don't work at the writing center then. He was that serious about it that he would never grade any work. Um, I can get in a little bit later into sort of how fascinating it is that he was successful in this way, because grades are traditionally used to control students. And so he was relinquishing that control. Nevertheless, we did the work, we had very productive discussions in his class. So it's an illuminating inquiry how he was able to achieve that. I want to sidestep a bit and talk about where grading comes from and its connection to punitive practices. So, my main source here is Michel Foucault. And if you're a student of education, Foucault is one of the big scholars. His legacy hangs over the whole field. Grading arose in the 18 and 1900s, and it was primarily used along with corporal punishment as a method of tracking and categorizing students. I have here the schematics for the panopticon, a very famous concept of Foucault's, because that is kind of the pinnacle of his exploration of power and how people can be controlled through visibility. But grading would be yet another method of this. It's very much a scientific procedure. It's meant to be objective. It's meant to rank and compare students against one another and produce a quantification which then can be used for ulterior purposes. And I'll discuss that below. Grading filled a big need in industrial society because students need to be sorted into various labor strata. So we needed to figure out who were the blue collar workers who are going to fix your car versus the white collar workers who are going to sit in an office. And grades would be used to determine those pathways. And indeed, grading still functions in that way in some countries. So, for instance, France has a very rigorous tracking system. I believe Germany does as well. Um, so, yeah, versions of this system still live on in some countries more forcefully or more consistently than they have in the US. Things have morphed here. Philosophically, I'm opposed to grading for spiritual reasons. That is, I find that grading emphasizes the personality. It emphasizes the ways in which we are different from one another, these rarefied aspects of ourselves. And indeed, those are real aspects of ourselves that in many circumstances in life are worth celebrating. So can look at the Olympics as kind of the apotheosis of this rarefication. And it's beautiful to see human beings performing feats which they alone can perform, or which they are the best in the world. That's an amazing thing. However, I would argue that in most situations in our lives, what is more interesting and more useful is to acknowledge our similarities, visible through concepts like soul or heart or spirit. And getting away from grading brings forth this aspect of ourselves. Rather than A students and B students and C students and so on and so forth, we just have human beings in a room trying to accomplish something, trying to learn something. And that's a very fertile place from which to begin any educational or any other endeavor. Um, yeah, when we have grades, this is my second point, they shift focus onto competition. There's much research on this as well. Basically, they produce nothing but strife, annoyance for teachers, and anxiety for students. Anxiety and heartbreak because the students are worrying, you know, I'm not as good as my peers, the grade is telling me that, I'm worthless, et cetera, et cetera. So they just create sadness and they don't aid learning in any way. There are plenty of alternative methods we can try in addition to the mandatory pass fail option that my college professor used. Um, this last semester, I experimented with something called contract grading, which, you know, of course, comes from the legal concept of a contract that two parties agree upon. Originally, contract grading was envisioned as something the teacher would present to the students. So the teacher would present a series of options. If you do, you know, all the work in the class and these few additional assignments, you get an A. If you do all the work in the class and you turn it in on time, you get a B. And if you do less than that, you get a C or something like that. And this is basically the teacher's way of saying, look, I'm not going to get into the nitpicky territory of, you know, this is an 85 versus an 86. Is there extra credit at the end of the semester so I can elevate my points? I'm just going to give flat grades in a tiered system. And we all agree at the very beginning what you do to get each grade. And from that point forward in the semester, we just focus on learning. We're not worried about grades. So that's a beautiful thing. As I note here, it also more equally distributes power among teacher and students, because the teacher is being more transparent with their methods. They're not serving as that panopticon, watching all the students and ranking them through some secret process. Um, in my class, I went a step further and I had my students write their own contracts. So they had their own criteria for each grade. And then I spoke with them about the contracts. And in some instances, I had them make their criteria more sophisticated, more nuanced, or more ambitious. You know, I had some kids say, to get an A, I have to come to class. Well, I think you're capable of more than that. So let's work on that. And then at the end of the semester, I had them evaluate themselves and say, based on what I did, you know, here's the grade I deserve. Um, so that's contract grading, and I've worked with that. Um, Even better, and I haven't tried this, but there is something called mastery-based learning. In mastery-based learning, essentially a school would have a set of skills that students need to have mastered in order to graduate from that school. Um, and all skills are considered pass-fail. Either you've demonstrated that you know this skill or not. And it's almost like a college curriculum within that rubric where students need to master all of the skills, but they can do so through customizable pathways. So, for instance, if I need to demonstrate that I can perform argumentative analysis, right? I can figure out how an argument is constructed. I could do that either through writing in English, or I could do it through a geometric proof in math, any way that sort of suits my interests and my wheelhouse. So as I say there, this method encourages interdisciplinarity. Um, it's also supposed to be based on real world learning. Mastery based learning is. So in the real world, skills are sequential. For instance, you need to learn to crawl before you can learn to stand, and then you can learn to walk, and and you can learn to run. No one grades each of those processes. Either you are good enough at one that you can move on to the next or not. And mastery based learning is supposed to replicate that. Additionally, because it's essentially a ubiquitous pass fail schema, it gets away from this competitive aspect of A through F grading. And I have here an image of a car mechanic because, that's the kind of setting this system comes from, where we want to learn things, but the grade is incidental, or maybe there is no grade. We're just learning from a master through feedback. Some obstacles that teachers will encounter to ungrading, just based on my own experience. The first is is psychic. So when I started doing contract grading, I realized I had nothing to hold over my student's head at the end of the quarter, end of the semester. In other words, I couldn't broker using fear. Um, I had one student I remember was really being a jerk in class, but he had satisfied all of his own criteria to get an A. So I was looking at his contract at the end of the semester and I was like, well, I want to take points off because I don't really like you. But I can't do that and be in integrity because we agreed upon these terms and you met them. And so what I was really encountering was a loss of the power that comes with the grade. If I had a participation grade, I could just knock points off, and that would be totally my prerogative, right? Students accept that. Um, but I talked with a friend about this who's been into ungrading for longer than I have, and he said just separate your feedback from the grade. Give the kid the A and tell him he's been kind of a dick. and, and that's what I did. And so when we are in the business of ungrading, it reinforces more humanistic relationships in the classroom. We remember, oh, he's a human being, I'm a human being. I can just tell him that I'm kind of annoyed with him, and that will have some effect because he wants to be liked by me and his peers, right? So the grading actually creates a kind of delusion where we forget this more naturalistic relation we have to one another, and we become artificial, we become fear-based in our practice. The second obstacle is institutional. So we exist in this ecosystem which is based on industrial society and these practices of tracking and managing, which you can see in the prison complex and the medical complex as well. Foucault has laid this out. Um, and grades are still needed at many transition points in the system. So although the SAT and ACT seem to be fading in their power, they still exist. And why is that? Colleges need them to rank students and to cut off at a certain quota. Okay, we need this many eligible students to assess more deeply for this class. So we're going to cut away everyone whose SAT score is below X. Our system still has points where those kinds of things are needed. So we exist within the system which reinforces grading. And I've met in that in my own school. So I work at a private prep school, and because I've done contract grading and other things, I've yielded a lot of A's because a lot of students meet their own criteria and feel good about things. And I want to support that. And I've been checked. People have said, oh, I'm worried about grade inflation. It doesn't really matter at all to me. It doesn't mean anything. The whole system doesn't mean anything to me. But you will encounter these institutional forces which have that kind of ossified understanding, and will tell you that those variables matter. Um, so I have here at the bottom, in order for one thing to change, everything needs to change. That is a phenomenon I find in education, and I believe it's true in other fields as well. There are all these interconnected stress points where it's like, well, I don't want to grade anymore, but the university is telling me at the high school level that I have to. You know, I don't want to discipline this student by sending them to detention because that feels archaic, but If I don't do it, then I'm not enforcing a policy, and other students are going to notice. So there are all these pressures, right? Um, but all in all, I have faith that every moment like this, every movement like this, does change things in tiny ways. And the system, after all, is made up of people, and people notice these sorts of ripples. And so, system change is slow but porous, and sort of below the level of verbal communication. So I think that's it. Yeah, that's my short presentation on ungrading. If you want more information on any of these subjects, I encourage you to look into Foucault's writing in particular. Brilliant breakdown of grading and educational practices in general, and where they come from, and why they resemble other deleterious practices. You can look into Tracy Santa. He was my writing center director at Colorado College who first set me on this path. You can look into contract grading. You can look into mastery-based learning as potential models to get away from grading. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening, for watching, and you're welcome to write me with any questions. All right, bye bye.